Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Easy English Spark. I'm so excited to have you here today. Get ready to dive into an exciting and mysterious story that will boost your English listening and speaking skills in a fun and engaging way. Today, we'll follow an intriguing tale full of secrets, unexpected twists, and thrilling discoveries. As you listen, you'll expand your vocabulary, sharpen your comprehension, and enhance your fluency without even realizing you're learning. So, sit back, listen carefully, and let's embark on this unforgettable journey together. Chapter 1: The Mysterious Teachers. My name is Emily Carter. My friends call me Em. I'm 16 years old and I live in a quiet town near Seattle. Life here is simple, but I've always wanted something more exciting. I love writing and dream of becoming a journalist someday. But I never expected that my first big story would start right in my high school. It all began on the first day of junior year. I woke up early, feeling a mix of excitement and nerves. New classes, new teachers, maybe even some new friends. After a quick breakfast, I grabbed my backpack and headed to school. On the way, I met my best friend, Sophie. "I hope our new teachers are interesting," Sophie said, adjusting her glasses. "Last year's classes were so boring." "I just hope." "They're nice," I replied. "I don't want another teacher who gives homework like it's a punishment." As we arrived at school, students were buzzing about the new faculty members. Apparently, we had a few new teachers this year, and nobody knew much about them. We entered our first period classroom, science. A young man was already there, standing at the front of the room. "Hello, everyone," he said with a warm smile. "My name is Mr. Reed, and I'll be your science teacher this year." Mr. Reed was tall, with neatly combed blonde hair and sharp blue eyes. He looked more like an athlete than a science teacher. Sophie nudged me. "He looks like a model," she whispered. I had to admit he did. But something about him felt different. The class went on as usual until something strange happened. A loud airplane flew over the school. Everyone instinctively turned to look out the window, but the sunlight was too bright, making us squint and turn away. Everyone except Mr. Reed. He stood there, eyes wide open, staring straight into the sun, not even blinking. I frowned. How could he do that? No one can look directly at the sun without hurting their eyes. The plane passed, and Mr. Reed turned back to us as if nothing had happened. I glanced at Sophie, but she didn't seem to notice. Maybe I was imagining things. After science, we had English. When we entered the classroom, the atmosphere changed immediately. A tall man with dark hair and piercing green eyes stood at the front. Unlike Mr. Reed, he didn't smile. His expression was cold, almost emotionless. "I am Mr. Grayson," he said in a deep, monotone voice. "I expect discipline in my classroom. No unnecessary talking. No foolishness. The lesson begins now." The entire class was silent. I exchanged a look with Sophie. This guy was intense. "A boy in the back, Jake," hesitantly raised his hand. Sir, what's your first name? Mr. Grayson slowly turned his gaze toward him. My name is not important, he said flatly. The whole class went dead quiet. Something about his voice was off. It was too flat, too mechanical, like a computer-generated voice. And when he spoke, his lips barely moved. I shivered. The lesson continued, but I found it hard to concentrate. There was something unnatural about Mr. Grayson. The way he moved, the way he barely blinked, the way his eyes seemed too sharp, too focused. At lunch, I met up with Sophie and our friend Ryan. What do you think of the new teachers? I asked, stirring my food absent-mindedly. Mr. Reed is cool, Ryan said. I mean, he's way too young to be a teacher, but whatever. And Mr. Grayson, he shuddered. That guy is creepy. He talks like a robot. Sophie nodded. Yeah, he's weird, but maybe he's just strict. Some teachers are like that. I wasn't so sure. Then Ryan pointed across the cafeteria. Look at Mr. Grayson. We turned. Mr. Grayson sat alone at the teacher's table. But instead of a normal lunch, he had a glass filled with thick green liquid, and in his hand, 3 small black pills. We watched as he dropped the pills into the liquid. The mixture bubbled, turning dark red. Then he picked up the glass and drank it all in one gulp. Sophie looked disgusted. What is that? Some kind of diet shake? Ryan shook his head. I don't think that's normal. I stared at Mr. Grayson, my unease growing. Something wasn't right about our new teachers, and I was going to find out what. Chapter 2. Suspicious Clues. I couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Grayson and Mr. Reed. Something about them felt unnatural. That night, as I lay in bed, my mind kept replaying the strange things I had seen. The way Mr. Reed stared into the sun without blinking, the way Mr. Grayson's voice sounded mechanical, and that bizarre drink he had at lunch. Maybe I was overthinking. Maybe they were just eccentric teachers with unusual habits. But deep down, I didn't believe that. The next day at school, I decided to pay closer attention. A peculiar observation. During English class, I couldn't help but watch Mr. Grayson closely. His movements were too precise, almost unnatural. He never hesitated, never fumbled with papers, and never seemed to get tired. At one point, Sophie dropped her pen and it rolled under his desk. She leaned down to grab it, but suddenly gasped. "What's wrong?" I whispered. She looked at me, her face pale. "His shoes, they're not normal." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "They don't have soles." I didn't understand what she meant until class ended. As we walked past his desk, I stole a quick glance at his feet. She was right. Mr. Grayson's shoes weren't like regular dress shoes. They didn't have any visible seams or laces, and the soles, they were completely smooth, like they weren't even made for walking. I swallowed hard. What kind of shoes don't have soles? The library investigation. After lunch, I met up with Ryan and Sophie in the library. We need to figure out who these guys really are, I said. Ryan leaned forward. Okay, but how? We can't just ask them if they're aliens. Not yet, I replied. But we can dig up some information. We started by searching for Mr. Grayson and Mr. Reed on the school's faculty page. Nothing. Their names weren't listed anywhere. Sophie frowned. That's impossible. Every teacher has a profile here. Ryan tried another approach, looking up the school's hiring records. Got it, he said after a few minutes. Mr. Reed and Mr. Grayson both started teaching here this semester, but guess what? There's no information on their previous schools. No work history, no employment records. It's like they appeared out of nowhere. My stomach turned. No background history? No records? That wasn't just strange. It was impossible. Maybe they transferred from another country. Sophie suggested. Ryan shook his head. Nope. Even international teachers have records. I sat back, my mind racing. What if they're not real teachers? Sophie and Ryan stared at me. You mean like imposters? Sophie asked. Ryan scoffed. That's crazy. Is it? I challenged. Think about it. Mr. Reed doesn't blink at the sun. Mr. Grayson talks like a machine. They don't have work records. And did I mention that Mr. Grayson drinks red bubbling liquid? Ryan's confidence wavered. Okay, yeah, that's pretty weird. Sophie bit her lip. So, what do we do? I took a deep breath. We spy on them. A strange discovery. That afternoon, we put our plan into action. Sophie volunteered to follow Mr. Reed, while Ryan and I would keep an eye on Mr. Grayson. Sophie followed Mr. Reed after school, trailing him down the hallways. But then, something bizarre happened. He walked straight to a janitor's closet and went inside. Confused, Sophie hid behind the lockers, waiting for him to come out. Minutes passed, then more. Finally, after nearly 10 minutes, she peeked inside. The closet. It was empty. No back door. No vents big enough for someone to escape through. Mr. Reed had vanished. Meanwhile, Ryan and I watched Mr. Grayson. He never left the school building. Instead, he went to the science lab and locked the door behind him. Ryan and I crouched outside, listening carefully. At first, we heard nothing. But then, a soft humming noise. It didn't sound like a normal machine. It was rhythmic, almost like a coded signal. Ryan pulled out his phone and recorded it. This doesn't sound like any machine I've heard before. Then we heard footsteps. We barely had time to hide before Mr. Grayson opened the door and stepped out. He looked around as if sensing something. For a moment I thought he had seen us. But then, he walked down the hallway and disappeared. Ryan exhaled. That was close. What was he doing in there? I whispered. Ryan glanced at the lab door. There's only one way to find out. The science lab raid. That evening, after most students had left, Ryan and I snuck back to the science lab. I tried the handle. Locked. Of course, Ryan grinned and pulled out a small paper clip. Lucky for you, I know a few tricks. I raised an eyebrow. Where did you learn to pick locks? Internet, he said proudly. After a few tries, the lock clicked open. We slipped inside and closed the door behind us. The lab looked normal. Beakers, test tubes, microscopes. But then we noticed a small refrigerator in the corner. I hesitated. Should we open it? Ryan nodded. I pulled the door open. Inside were rows of small glass bottles, each filled with the same thick green liquid we saw Mr. Grayson drinking. Ryan carefully picked one up. What is this stuff? Before I could answer, something caught my eye. A file on the desk. I flipped it open and scanned the contents. It was filled with notes, handwritten notes, and then I saw it. One line that sent chills down my spine. Arrival date, September 1st. Primary objective, observation. Secondary objective, experimentation. Arrival, experimentation. This wasn't a teacher's file. It was a mission report. Ryan and I exchanged terrified glances. This wasn't just a weird science experiment. Something bigger was happening at our school, and Mr. Grayson and Mr. Reed weren't who they claimed to be. We had just uncovered something dangerous, and we were about to become part of it. Chapter 3. Theories of the Unknown. I couldn't concentrate in class the next day. How could I? Ryan and I had found evidence, actual proof that Mr. Grayson and Mr. Reed were not normal teachers. Their mysterious notes, the eerie humming in the yard, science lab, the bubbling green liquid in their refrigerator. It all pointed to one conclusion. They weren't from here. Sophie sat across from me at lunch, stirring her soup absent-mindedly. So, let me get this straight, she whispered. You found some weird notes about arrival and experimentation, a strange liquid, and Mr. Reed disappeared into thin air? I nodded. Ryan leaned in. We need to figure out exactly what they are. If they're not human, what are they? That was the question burning in my mind, too. Theories are 1. Government agents. Sophie tapped her fingers on the table. Okay, first theory. They're government agents. Ryan raised an eyebrow. Government agents who drink glowing green liquid and don't have employment records? Think about it, Sophie insisted. Maybe they're part of some secret science project. You said they had mission reports, right? That could mean they're observing us for research. Maybe they're testing some kind of experimental serum, and that's why they act so strange. I shook my head. If they were government, they'd have some kind of background, but there's nothing. No records, no previous jobs, no history at all. Sophie frowned. Okay, fair point. Ryan snapped his fingers. Wait. What if they're not here to study us? What if they're studying something else? I blinked. Like what? Ryan leaned closer. What if there's something going on in this town? Something paranormal or supernatural, and they're here investigating it. Sophie looked thoughtful. That could explain why Mr. Reed disappeared. Maybe he has access to some kind of cloaking technology. Ryan nodded. And what about the humming noise we heard in the lab? What if it's some kind of signal? I considered the possibility. It was possible. But something didn't sit right. If they were scientists investigating something paranormal, I said slowly, why hide it? Why pretend to be teachers? No one had an answer. Theory, number 2. Time. Travelers. Ryan grinned. All right, new theory, they're time travelers. Sophie laughed. Okay, now you're just messing with us. Ryan shrugged. No, hear me out. What if they came from the future? That would explain why they don't have past records, because their past hasn't happened yet. I actually paused at that. It would explain their lack of history. Sophie still looked skeptical. And what about the green liquid? Time travelers need glowing smoothies to survive? Ryan hesitated. Maybe it's a supplement to help them adjust to our timeline. I frowned. Then why act like teachers? If you came from the future, wouldn't you want to observe the whole world, not just a random high school? Ryan sighed. Fine, maybe that one's a stretch. Theory number 3, aliens. Sophie hesitated before saying it. What if they're aliens? Ryan and I went silent. That was the theory I had been afraid to say out loud. Everything about them was wrong. The way Mr. Reed never blinked at the sun, the way Mr. Grayson's voice sounded like a recording, their strange behaviors, the humming noise in the lab, and, of course, the notes. Arrival date. Experimentation. I exhaled. If they are aliens, what are they doing here? Ryan tapped the table. They could be here to study human life. Or, Sophie added, they could be here to replace us. That thought made my stomach twist. I looked around the cafeteria. Kids were laughing, eating, completely unaware of the fact that 2 of their teachers might not even be human. If they're replacing people, Ryan said carefully, how would we even know? Sophie shivered. Maybe the real Mr. Grayson and Mr. Reed were human, and they've been taken. I clenched my fists. We need more proof. We can't just guess what they are. We have to catch them doing something undeniable. Ryan nodded. Agreed. We need a real plan. A dangerous plan. That afternoon, we came up with a strategy. Step 1. Follow them again. Step 2. Gather physical evidence, more than just notes. Step 3. Confront them. It was risky. It was dangerous, but it was the only way to find the truth. following. Mr. Reed. That evening, Sophie followed Mr. Reed again. This time, he didn't go into the janitor's closet. Instead, he walked behind the school, toward the wooded area near the old track field. Sophie stayed far behind, hiding behind trees as she watched. Then, suddenly, he vanished again, just disappeared. No sound, no movement. 1 second he was there, the next he was gone. Sophie ran forward, looking for any sign of where he had gone. Then she saw it, a glowing imprint on the ground, almost like a faint blue ripple in the air. She reached out to touch it, and her hand went through it. Inside the lab. Meanwhile, Ryan and I snuck into the science lab again. This time, we weren't just looking. We were searching. Ryan dug through the desk while I checked the refrigerator again. Everything was the same, except one thing. A second file. I opened it and my heart stopped. Inside was a list of names. Our names, mine, Ryan's, and Sophie's, and next to them, one word, noticed. My breath caught in my throat. They knew we were watching, and now we were targets, a sudden confrontation. We didn't hear the door open. We didn't hear the footsteps. We only realized someone was there when a cold, mechanical voice spoke behind us. Curiosity, Mr. Grayson's voice said, can be dangerous. I turned. He stood in the doorway, his expression blank. His eyes, which I could have sworn were brown, now had a faint silver glow to them. Ryan tensed. I glanced at the list again. We had made a mistake. They weren't just watching us. They were coming for us next. Chapter 4. Unusual Encounters. A chill ran down my spine as Mr. Grayson stood in the doorway, his gaze locked onto us. His eyes, which I knew had been brown before, now had a faint, unnatural silver sheen. We were trapped. I glanced at Ryan, who had stiffened beside me. Sophie was still outside in the woods, following Mr. Reed. She had no idea that we were in trouble. My heart pounded. Mr. Grayson stepped forward. You three have been quite curious lately. His voice was calm, but there was something eerie about it. Too even, too precise, like it was carefully constructed rather than naturally spoken. Ryan tried to act casual. We were just looking for supplies. Mr. Grayson's lips curled into the slightest smile. Is that so? I clutched the file tighter behind my back, trying to hide the list with our names on it. I knew we had to get out of there. Fast. But then, Mr. Grayson blinked. Just once, and in that single blink, his eyes turned completely black. I gasped. Ryan took an unconscious step backward. A low hum filled the air, the same strange sound we had heard before in the science lab. It seemed to be coming from him, vibrating in the walls, in the very air around us. The lights flickered. Then, just as quickly, his eyes shifted back to normal. The hum stopped. The lights steadied. It was as if nothing had happened. Mr. Grayson tilted his head slightly. "Run along now. It's getting late." He turned and walked out, leaving the door open behind him. Neither of us moved for several seconds. Then, Ryan exhaled sharply. "Did you—" "Yes," I interrupted. "I saw it. His eyes, the noise, the lights." Ryan grabbed my arm. "We need to go. Now." We ran out of the lab without looking back. A midnight meeting. That night, the three of us met at Sophie's house. She had her own shocking news. "I found something," she whispered. "When I followed Mr. Reed into the woods, he vanished, just disappeared. But there was this weird glowing distortion in the air where he had been standing. When I touched it, my hand went through it. My breath caught. Like a portal?" Sophie nodded. Ryan ran a hand through his hair. "Okay, we're way past the point of coincidence. The glowing liquid, the missing records, the disappearing acts, and now portals." Sophie leaned forward. "And Mr. Grayson's eyes." I swallowed. Hard. "They know we're onto them." I pulled out the file we had taken from the lab and laid it on Sophie's desk. She gasped when she saw the list. Our names. Marked. Noticed. Sophie's face paled. "So, what happens when they move past noticing?" None of us had an answer. Ryan clenched his fists. "We need to confront them." I stared at him. "Are you insane? We just saw that Mr. Grayson's eyes turned black. And you want to go straight to them?" Ryan exhaled. "Okay, maybe not straight to them. But we need to figure out where they're going. We need more than just weird notes and strange eyes. We need real proof." Sophie tapped her chin. "We could set up cameras." Ryan snapped his fingers. "Yes, we'll hide them near the woods. If Mr. Reed is using a portal, maybe we can record it." I hesitated. "And what if they find the cameras?" Sophie bit her lip. "Then we'll know for sure that they're hiding something." That was true. But if they found out what we were doing, I didn't want to think about what might happen. The stranger in the library. The next day at school, I tried to act normal. Tried. But I could feel Mr. Grayson watching me in English class. I could feel Mr. Reed's unnatural stillness in the hallway, as if he wasn't just standing there, but studying everyone who walked past. Something was going to happen. I just didn't know when. After school, I went to the library to check out some books. Maybe I thought reading would take my mind off things. Maybe I just wanted a place to think. That's when I met him. I had never seen him before. A tall, older man, standing in the history section, flipping through a book on ancient civilizations. He wore a dark coat, and his hair was graying at the edges. His expression was unreadable. When I passed by, he closed the book and looked directly at me. You and your friends, he said suddenly, are playing a dangerous game. I froze. Excuse me? The man took a step closer. I know what you're looking for. I know what you've seen. My heart started racing. Who are you? The man exhaled slowly. Someone who tried to do what you're doing a long time ago. I stared at him. He knew. He knew. What? What are they? I asked. The man's eyes darkened. Something that doesn't belong here. I gripped my backpack straps. Why are they here? He hesitated. Then he shook his head. I can't tell you that. I felt a flash of frustration. Then why are you warning me? He gave me a long look. Because I was in your place once, and I lost someone because of it. My breath hitched. He turned to leave. I couldn't let him go. Wait! I grabbed his sleeve. Who are you? How do you know all this? The man pulled away. I already said too much. Then, before I could ask another question, he was gone. Like he had never been there at all. The final decision. That night, I told Ryan and Sophie everything. Ryan clenched his jaw. So someone else knows about them. Sophie shivered. And if he lost someone, that means this isn't just a game. This is real, and it's dangerous. I nodded. Which is why we need to decide. Do we stop now? Pretend we never saw anything? Ryan exhaled. You know we can't do that. Sophie bit her lip. But what if we get hurt? I thought about the man in the library. I thought about the way he had looked at me, like he had already seen the ending of this story, like he had lived it. I exhaled. We move forward, I said finally. Ryan nodded. Sophie hesitated, then nodded. Too. We were in this, all the way. Whatever was happening in our school, we were going to find out the truth. Chapter 5. Following the Trail. The decision had been made. We were going to find the truth, no matter what it took, the surveillance plan. After school, the three of us met in Sophie's garage. Ryan had brought his brother's old spy camera, a small, nearly invisible device that could be hidden among the trees. Sophie had borrowed a pair of binoculars from her dad, and I had a notebook ready to document anything suspicious. This is it, Ryan said, setting the camera down on the workbench. We hide this near the woods where Mr. Reed disappeared. If he uses the portal again, we'll catch him on video. Sophie nodded. We also need a way to track Mr. Grayson. He's just as weird as Reed. I thought about the strange hum in the air whenever Mr. Grayson was in the room, the unnatural flickering of the lights. He's hiding something too. Maybe he's connected to the portal somehow. Ryan crossed his arms. So we follow them both. We need to figure out exactly what's going on. We worked out our plan. Sophie and I would focus on monitoring the portal, site near the woods. Ryan would shadow Mr. Grayson, watching where he went and what he did. If anything strange happened, we would meet up and regroup immediately. It was a risky plan. But we had no other choice. We had to see this through. Into the woods. The next morning, Sophie and I left class early and slipped into the woods behind the school. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and the trees cast long shadows. Across the forest floor, we crouched behind a large oak tree. "This should be a good spot," Sophie whispered. I nodded and handed her the camera. "Make sure it's angled toward where you saw the portal." She carefully secured the device between two branches, making sure the lens was hidden by leaves. Done. Now we waited. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Then a crack of twigs. I held my breath. Through the trees a figure was moving. It was Mr. Reed. He walked slowly, cautiously, glancing over his shoulder as if to make sure no one was watching. Then he stopped, right in front of where Sophie had seen the portal. We pressed ourselves against the tree, barely daring to breathe. Mr. Reed raised his hand, tracing something in the air, something invisible to us. Then a soft glow appeared, shimmering like heat waves in the summer air. My heart pounded, the glow intensified, and then Mr. Reed stepped forward and vanished. Sophie clapped a hand over her mouth to muffle a gasp. The air around the glow shimmered. Once more, then the light disappeared. I turned to Sophie, my voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me you got that." She looked down at the camera's screen, eyes wide. "It's all on video." Ryan's discovery. We met up with Ryan after school, our minds still reeling from what we had seen. "You guys won't believe what I found out," Ryan said, out of breath. "Try us," I said. Crossing my arms, Ryan leaned in. "I followed Mr. Grayson today. After his last class, he went to the old abandoned science lab behind the school. You know, the one they shut down years ago because of that chemical spill?" I frowned. "No one's supposed to go in there." "Exactly," Ryan said. "But..." I watched him go inside. Sophie and I exchanged glances. "So what did you do?" I asked. Ryan hesitated. "I might have snuck in after him." Sophie groaned. "Ryan, are you crazy?" Ryan ignored her. "Listen, I hid behind some old shelves and I saw him take something out of a locked cabinet. It was a vial of some glowing blue liquid." My stomach tightened. "Glowing?" Ryan nodded. "And guess what else? He pulled out a file with our names in it." My blood went cold. "What?" Sophie whispered. "He's tracking us," Ryan said, "and he knows we've been watching him." The warning. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mr. Reed stepping into the portal. I saw Mr. Grayson's unnatural black eyes. I saw the file with our names on it. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke up to a loud tapping at my window. My heart stopped. I slowly turned my head. A figure stood outside, tall, motionless, watching me. I swallowed hard. I reached for my phone, and the figure was gone. But on my windowsill, a single sheet of paper with 2 words scrawled in red ink. Stop now. What's next? The next morning, I showed the note to Ryan and Sophie. Ryan clenched his jaw. So they know. They know what we're doing. Sophie looked genuinely shaken. This is too much. What if we're in real danger? I took a deep breath. We already are, Ryan set his jaw. Then we have 2 choices. We run or we fight. Silence stretched between us. Then, Sophie looked up. I say we fight. I nodded. Ryan nodded. We were in this now. No turning back. Chapter 6. The Midnight Discovery. The warning note had changed everything. We knew now that we weren't just investigating something strange. We were being watched. Someone, or something, was trying to stop us from uncovering the truth. But that only made us more determined. We needed answers, and we needed them tonight. A dangerous plan. Ryan slammed his notebook shut. If Mr. Grayson is tracking us, he must be keeping information somewhere safe. I nodded. And that safe place is probably the abandoned science lab. Sophie shifted uneasily. Breaking into a forbidden lab at night? That's next level? Crazy, I sighed. We've come this far. We saw Reed vanish. We saw Grayson with those files. And now someone is leaving us threats. Ryan crossed his arms. This is our only chance to find out what's really going on. Sophie hesitated, then nodded. Fine. But we do this smart. We made a plan. Midnight, we'd meet near the school. Ryan would keep watch outside. Sophie and I would go inside and search for evidence. If anything went wrong, we'd get out. Fast. This was the riskiest thing we had ever done. But we had no other choice. Breaking in. The night was cold. Too quiet. As we crept toward the abandoned science lab, my heart pounded. The old building loomed in the darkness, its broken windows staring like empty eyes. Ryan gave us a thumbs up from his hiding spot. Coast is clear, I nodded at Sophie. Let's go. We crept to the side entrance. The door was locked. But Sophie had come prepared. She pulled out Matt's stolen police pass key. Let's hope this works. She slid the key into the lock. Click. The door swung open. I swallowed hard. We're really doing this. Sophie took a shaky breath. Let's move inside the lab. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of dust and chemicals. We flicked on our flashlights. The hallway stretched ahead of us, lined with old lockers and faded posters of the periodic table. We moved cautiously, checking each room as we passed. Then we reached the main lab. My flashlight beam swept across the room. Everything was covered in dust, except for one metal cabinet in the corner. No dust, no cobwebs. Someone had been here recently. Sophie pointed. That's where he's keeping something, I nodded. Let's open it. The files. The cabinet was locked. Of course it was. Step aside, Sophie whispered, pulling out a bobby pin. I've seen my brother do this. She knelt down, fiddling with the lock. Seconds passed. Then, click. The cabinet door creaked open. Inside were dozens of folders, some marked with strange symbols, others with our names. I yanked out the one labeled Emma Carter. Inside were pages of documents, recordings of my schedule, notes on my activities, even photos of me at school. Sophie's voice was a whisper. They've been watching us for weeks. I flipped through the pages, my hands shaking. Then my eyes landed on something that made my blood run cold. A list with two names, Emma Carter, Ryan Porter. Sophie gasped. Emma, that's you, and Ryan. My throat went dry. They had chosen us. For what? The secret room. A noise echoed down the hallway. Footsteps. Sophie grabbed my arm. Someone's coming. We shut the cabinet and killed our flashlights. The footsteps got closer. Then, a low hum filled the air. It was the same hum I had felt around Mr. Grayson before. The lights in the hallway flickered. We had seconds before we were caught. Sophie's eyes darted around. Then she pointed to a vent in the wall. There! We scrambled inside, crawling into the darkness. The footsteps entered the lab. I held my breath. A shadow loomed across the vent. For a moment, I thought we were caught. Then, the figure moved toward the metal cabinet. I peeked through the vent's slats. It was Mr. Grayson. He opened the cabinet, scanning the files. Then he pulled out a small black device and placed it on the shelf. A red light blinked. Sophie whispered, "What is that?" I swallowed hard. A tracker. Mr. Grayson closed the cabinet and stepped away. Then, without a word, he vanished. Not through a door, not through the hall. He simply disappeared into thin air. Sophie grabbed my wrist. Did you see that? I nodded. He teleported. A desperate escape. We had to get out. Fast. Crawling back through the vent, we slipped into the hallway. But as we crept toward the exit, a loud beep filled the air. The tracker. It had detected us. The building's security system activated. Red lights flashed. Sophie grabbed my arm. Run! We bolted down the hallway, sprinting for the exit. Behind us, metal shutters slammed down, sealing off rooms. We barely made it through the door before the entire building locked down. Ryan was already waiting outside. What happened? He shouted. We saw him, I gasped. We saw Grayson vanish. Ryan's eyes widened. And? I pulled the file from my jacket. They're targeting us. Ryan stared at the list. What do they want with us? I shook my head. I don't know. Sophie looked at the lab's locked doors. But we just made it personal. What now? had more questions than ever. Who was choosing the students? Where did Grayson go? What was going to happen on Friday night? One thing was certain. We weren't just investigators anymore. We were targets, and time was running out. Chapter 7. The Chosen Ones. The night's events had changed everything. We weren't just chasing a mystery anymore. We were part of it. Someone, or something, had chosen us, and we needed to find out why. A plan to unravel the truth. The next morning, Ryan, Sophie, and I met at our usual spot, the abandoned gazebo behind the library. None of us had slept. Ryan tossed the file onto the wooden table. So? What now? I took a deep breath. We find out what it means. Sophie ran her hands through her hair. Emma, they've been watching us for weeks. They chose you and Ryan for something. What if... She hesitated. Ryan crossed his arms. What if what? Sophie looked around as if checking for hidden eyes. Then, in a hushed voice, she said, What if they're planning to take you? Silence. The wind rustled through the trees. I felt my stomach tighten. It sounded ridiculous, but after everything we had seen, the teleportation, the secret files, the list of names, nothing seemed impossible anymore. Ryan leaned forward. If they are planning something, we need to find out where and when. I pulled the file back toward me, flipping through the pages. Then I found it. A date, a time, a location. Friday, 9:30 p.m. The abandoned airfield. Ryan whistled. Looks like we just found our answer. Sophie swallowed hard. That's tonight, the airfield connection. We knew that Mr. Grayson and whoever he was working with had been planning something big for Friday night. And now, we knew where to find them. Sophie tapped her fingers against the table. We need to go there before they do. See what's waiting. I nodded. If we can figure out what's really happening, maybe we can stop it. Ryan frowned. And if we can't? Nobody answered, because the truth was, we didn't know what we were walking into. But one thing was certain. They had chosen us, and we were going to find out why. A race against time. The day dragged on in slow motion. Every class, every conversation felt like background noise. All I could think about was tonight. The clock ticked closer to 9:30 p.m., and my pulse raced with every passing second. By 9 we were already on our way to the airfield. It was a forgotten place, abandoned years ago, left to rust under the weight of time. The cracked pavement was overgrown with weeds. The skeletal remains of an old hangar loomed in the distance. A single light flickered from within. Someone was already here. Ryan whispered, "We're not alone." Sophie pulled out her phone. "I'm recording this." I took a deep breath. "Let's move." Inside the hangar. We crept through the broken entrance. our footsteps silent against the dust-covered floor. The inside of the hangar was massive, a dark cavern stretching into shadow. Then we saw it. A circle of strange metallic devices, blinking, with blue lights. In the center stood a tall, curved structure, glowing faintly in the darkness. I whispered, "What is that?" Ryan stepped forward. "It looks like a gate." A cold realization hit me. It wasn't just any gate. It was a portal, and it was active. The truth revealed. Footsteps echoed from the far end of the hangar. We froze. Then, out of the shadows, Mr. Grayson stepped forward. But he wasn't alone. Beside him was a woman in a sleek silver coat, and she wasn't human. Her skin shimmered like liquid metal under the dim light. Her eyes were a piercing shade of violet. She tilted her head, studying us with an eerie curiosity. "So," she murmured, her voice like silk, "the chosen ones have arrived." Ryan clenched his fists. "Chosen for what?" Grayson gave a slow, knowing smile. "For something greater than you could possibly imagine. A fateful decision." The woman took a step toward us. "We have been watching you," she said. "You possess something unique." I swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" She turned her violet gaze on me. "Your world is changing. The universe is changing. And we are offering you a choice." Ryan narrowed his eyes. "What kind of choice?" Grayson finally spoke. "You can leave. Forget everything you've seen. Walk away and continue your ordinary lives." The woman's gaze darkened. "Or," she continued, "you can step through the portal." A deep hum filled the air as the portal's glow intensified. Sophie took a shaky breath. "And if we do?" The woman smiled. "You will never be the same again." I looked at Ryan. Ryan looked at Sophie. None of us spoke, because we already knew the answer. This wasn't just a mystery anymore. It was an invitation, and the only way to uncover the truth was to step into the unknown. Chapter 8. The Difficult Choice. I never imagined that Paul would make such a decision. I never thought, even for a second, that he would willingly choose to leave this planet. But that night, sitting in his dimly lit bedroom, I realized that, I had completely misjudged how he felt about his life. It started when I called him to tell him about the hypnotizing spray. I was excited. I had tested it on Fred, and it worked. The dog, who usually hated taking baths and eating leftovers, had obeyed without hesitation. That meant we had successfully taken away Cly's only weapon. We had won. But when Paul answered the phone, his voice was different. There was no excitement, no relief. Just a quiet, serious tone. "Can you come over? I need to talk to you," he said. "Paul, are you okay?" I asked. "Yeah. Just come over. It's important." Something in my stomach twisted. I could tell without knowing why that whatever he was about to say would change everything. I grabbed my jacket, took a bus to his house, and the whole way there, I felt like I was walking toward something inevitable. When I arrived, Paul was sitting on his bed, his black cat, Apollo, curled up in his lap. He was absent-mindedly stroking its fur, staring at the floor. The room was eerily quiet. I stood in the doorway, waiting for him to speak. Finally, he looked up at me. "Jenny, I want to go to Matrix," he said. I blinked. "What?" "I want to go with Cly to their planet," he repeated, his voice calm, steady, too steady. I felt like the ground had just been pulled out from under me. "Paul, no, you can't be serious," I shouted. "This isn't a joke. These are aliens. You don't know what they'll do to you." He sighed, placing Apollo on the bed and standing up. He faced me, arms crossed, like he had been preparing for this argument. "Jenny, listen to me. This world, it's not for me," he said. "What are you talking about?" I demanded. "You don't understand," he continued, his voice heavy with something I had never heard before. "Look at my life. My mom left me. She doesn't even want to see me. Do you know what that feels like? To have your own mother decide you're not. Worth it?" I swallowed hard, but he wasn't finished. "My dad barely knows I exist. He's always at work, always chasing after some new woman. And at school? I don't belong there either. Everyone thinks I'm weird. Too smart. Too quiet. Too different." "That's not true," I said weakly. "It is, Jenny." "You know it is," he said. "But this is something different. This is my chance. My chance to go somewhere where none of that matters. To go somewhere where I can start over." I shook my head. "You're not thinking straight," I said, my voice trembling. "Running away to another planet isn't going to fix anything." "I'm not running away," Paul said. "I'm finally going towards something I've always wanted." I took a step closer, desperate to make him understand. "But Paul, this is crazy. What if they hurt you? What if you never come back?" "I don't think they want to hurt anyone," he said. "If they did, they wouldn't need a hypnotizing spray. They could have just taken us. But they didn't. They wanted us to come willingly. And I do, Jenny. I really do." I felt tears pricking my eyes. "Paul, please don't do this," I whispered. For the first time, his expression softened. He reached out and took my hand, his fingers warm against mine. "Jenny, I know this is hard, but I need you to understand," he said gently. "I've always dreamed about space. Ever since I was a kid, I've read about the stars, the galaxies, the possibility of life beyond Earth. And now I have the chance to see it, to live it. This is my dream." "But what about me?" I choked out. Paul's grip on my hand tightened. "You're my best friend, Jenny, and I will miss you more than anything. But this is something I have to do." I shook my head again, trying to hold back my tears. And what if you're wrong? I asked. What if this isn't what you think it is? What if you regret it? Paul was silent for a moment, then he smiled. Just a small, sad smile. Then I'll live with it, he said. But I have to try. A tear slipped down my cheek, and before I could stop myself, I threw my arms around him, hugging him tight. I don't want to lose you, I whispered. You won't, he said softly. I pulled away, wiping my eyes. You're not coming back, are you? I asked. Paul hesitated, then exhaled. I don't know, he admitted, but I want to believe that someday I will. I let out a shaky laugh. Don't make promises you can't keep. I'm not, he said. I promise, Jenny. One day I'll find my way back. I didn't believe him. Not really. He turned, walked over to Apollo and picked him up. Then, to my surprise, he placed the cat in my arms. I want you to take care of him for me, he said. I looked down at the cat, then back at Paul. Paul, no. This is your cat. And I trust you with him, he said. I held Apollo close, feeling his soft fur against my cheek. Then, before I could think, before I could stop myself, I leaned forward and kissed him. It was quick, just a second, but it was everything. A silent goodbye. When I pulled away, Paul smiled at me. Thank you, Jenny, for everything. I didn't trust myself to speak. I just nodded. That night, I lay in bed with Apollo curled up beside me, staring at the ceiling, trying to process everything. Tomorrow, he would be gone, and I would never see him again. Chapter 9. The Final Night. The night had finally come. The night Paul would leave. All day, I had felt a tight knot in my stomach, a tension that wouldn't go away. No matter how hard I tried to focus, I couldn't stop thinking about what was going to happen. By the end of the night, Paul would be gone, taken away to an alien planet, beyond anything I could imagine. And worst of all, there was nothing I could do to stop it. As the sun set, my parents and I walked to Jefferson High for the family teacher meeting. The school auditorium was already filling up with students and their families. It was supposed to be a normal night, a night of speeches, presentations, and discussions about our academic future. But I knew that somewhere in the building, Cly was preparing to carry out his final mission. I scanned the room, looking for him, and then I saw it. Mr. Adams, or rather, Cly, stood near the side of the auditorium, watching the crowd carefully. He wasn't paying attention to the teachers or the parents. He was scanning the students, looking for his replacements. I glanced at Paul's empty chair. He wasn't here. He had told me he wouldn't come. Instead, he would go straight to the airfield to wait for Cly's spaceship. That left Cly in need of a second student. I followed his gaze as he settled on Dana. No. I watched in horror as he leaned down and whispered something to Dana's parents. Then he moved to another family, Steve's. He did the same thing, whispering to them, convincing them of something. A few moments later, Dana and Steve stood up and followed him. I gritted my teeth. So, that's how he's doing it. He wasn't forcing them. He was making up some excuse, something to get them alone, and then he would take them to the science lab, where he would use his hypnotizing spray and make them follow him willingly. Except, he didn't have the spray anymore. Had stolen it. I watched as the three of them slipped out of the auditorium. I had a choice to make. I could stay here, pretend nothing was happening, and let Dana and Steve disappear forever. Or I could stop it. I didn't hesitate. "Jenny, where are you going?" my mom asked as I got up. "I'll be right back," I lied, quickly making my way out of the auditorium. I rushed through the empty hallways, my heart pounding, my breath short. The school felt eerie at night, the dim lights flickering slightly. By the time I reached the science lab, the door was already closed. Inside, I could hear Cly's voice. "Where is it?" he hissed, frustrated. I smiled to myself. He had opened the fridge. He had realized the spray was gone. I heard Dana's voice. "Are you talking about the hypnotizing spray you lost, Cly?" she said, her voice defiant. I almost gasped. Dana knew? Steve, on the other hand, sounded completely confused. "Wait, what spray? What are you guys talking about?" I took a deep breath and pushed open the door. Cly spun around, eyes wide. He looked panicked. "You," he muttered, staring at me. "Me," I said, stepping into the room. "Problem, Cly?" Dana smirked. "Looks like your plan failed." I crossed my arms. You can't hypnotize them. You can't make them come willingly. And you can't take them by force either, because if you touch them, you'll electrocute them. Cly's eyes darted between us. For the first time, he looked powerless. "Then I have no choice," he muttered. He turned and, "Shanna's, where are you going?" Steve asked. I glanced at my watch. 17 p.m. He's going to the airfield, I realized. His spaceship is leaving soon. He can't miss it. Without another word, I turned and ran after him. I chased him down the hall, out of the building, and into the dark streets beyond. The old abandoned airfield wasn't far from our school. It was maybe a 10-minute walk. But Cly was fast. By the time I reached the open field, the spaceship was already there. It was massive. A metallic, silver craft with no visible doors or windows. It hovered just a few feet above the ground, completely silent, as if waiting for its final passenger. And standing there, just outside the ship, was Paul. I stopped running. Paul turned and saw me. He smiled. "Jenny," he said. I felt my throat tighten. I wanted to say so many things. I wanted to beg him to stay, to tell him that Earth wasn't as bad as he thought, that I would be there for him, that he wasn't alone. But I knew it wouldn't change anything. So, this is it? I asked, forcing a smile. Paul nodded. This is it. I blinked back tears. I still think you're crazy, you know. He laughed. Yeah, I know. Cly had already started walking up the ramp to the spaceship. The portal was closing. Paul, hurry! Cly called. Paul turned to me. For a moment we just stood there, staring at each other. Then he stepped forward and wrapped me in a tight hug. Thank you, Jenny, for everything, he whispered. I closed my eyes. I'll miss you. I'll miss you too. He pulled away, took one last look at me, and then he ran up the ramp. The portal sealed behind him. The spaceship began to glow, and then it lifted into the sky. It rose higher and higher, faster than anything I'd ever seen. The lights of the ship pulsed once, twice, and then it was gone. I stood there, staring at the empty sky, tears rolling down my cheeks. Paul was gone. For a long time, I didn't move. Then finally, I turned back and walked toward the school. The meeting was still going on. My parents wouldn't even know I had left. Dana and Steve would be back in their seats, safe. Everything would go back to normal. But for me, nothing would ever be the same again. That night, I lay in bed, staring out my window at the stars. Wondered where he was, and I wondered if he would ever come back. Chapter 10. Life moves on. 6 months have passed since that night. 6 months since I watched Paul disappear into the sky. 6 months since my life changed forever. Sometimes, it feels like everything has gone back to normal. The school year continues. Tests pile up, teachers give their lectures, and students go about their daily routines as if nothing ever happened. But for me, nothing is the same. I still remember standing in that empty airfield, staring up at the stars, wondering if I would ever see Paul again. Some nights, I still do the same thing. I sit in my backyard, Apollo curled up in my lap, and I look at the night sky, hoping, waiting. But deep down, I know the truth. He's gone, and I might never see him again. The school, of course, had to replace Mr. Adams. They hired Ms. Lundberg, a woman in her late 40s who seems normal. No glowing eyes, no robotic voices, no strange diets. Just a regular science teacher with glasses, a ponytail, and a love for chemistry. The first time she stood in front of the class, I felt a wave of relief. No more aliens pretending to be teachers, at least not that I know of. Mr. Stone is still here. And to my surprise, over the past few months, he's changed. He smiles more, interacts with students, and even jokes, something I never thought I would see. The whole school has stopped being afraid of him. I guess once you stop seeing someone as a mystery, you start seeing them as a person. I visit him sometimes. Not as a student, but as a friend. We sit in his living room and I listened to his stories about his illness, his struggles, his loneliness. And somehow, I understand him better now. He reminds me of Paul in some ways. Both of them felt like outsiders, like they didn't belong. Only Paul's solution was to leave. Mr. Stone's solution was to stay and try again. Dana is still Dana. She's still obsessed with boys, still dramatic about every little thing, still talking about the comet as if aliens might come back any second. But something about her has changed, too. That night in the science lab, she stood up to Cly. She wasn't afraid. And ever since then, I've noticed she's become a little braver, a little more confident in herself. She and Steve started dating after the whole incident. I guess almost getting kidnapped by an alien creates a bond. They make a good couple, and me, I'm different now. I still go to school, still do my homework, still hang out with Dana. On the surface, I look like the same person, but I know that I'm not. I see things differently now. I used to think the world was simple. People were either normal or they weren't. They were either good or bad, real or impossible. Now, I know that nothing is ever that simple. I still have the hypnotizing spray. I keep it hidden in my room, tucked away in a box at the back of my closet. I know I should throw it away, destroy it, get rid of the last piece of Cly's plan. But for some reason, I can't. Maybe it's because it reminds me of what we went through, or maybe, deep down, I just want to keep something from that night. Something from Paul. I only use it once in a while, on Fred, whenever he needs a bath. Paul's disappearance was strange, but people at school eventually stopped talking about it. At first, his father was furious, searching for him, filing reports, demanding answers. But when weeks passed and no leads turned up, he gave up. I think deep down, he never really cared. And that makes me even sadder than the fact that Paul is gone. Sometimes Dana and I talk about him. We wonder what he's doing, what he's seeing, if he's okay. We make up stories about what life on Metrix must be like. Do you think he's still wearing his school uniform? Dana once joked. I hope not. I laughed. If he is, he's probably the worst-dressed human in the galaxy. We laugh, but the truth is, we don't know. And that's the hardest part. The only thing I can do now is wait. I know I might never hear from Paul again. I might never know what happened to him, if he's happy, if he ever regrets leaving. But I want to believe. I want to believe that one day he'll come back. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next year, but someday. And when he does, I'll be waiting. I'll be right here, looking up at the stars. Great work today. Every moment you spend practicing brings you closer to mastering your English listening and speaking skills. Remember, progress comes with patience and consistency. If this story inspired you or helped you in your learning journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Easy English Spark channel for more lessons and stories. Keep listening, keep speaking, and keep believing in your growth. I'll see you in the next video. Take care and keep shining.